And Jennifer, I think we can get started whenever you're ready.
Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Sylvie, and I serve as the Managing Director for the Secretariat of the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Global Financial Market Center at Duke Law and the committee, which is a group of 10 senior leaders from the financial services and policy arenas who are working to ensure the United States meets its Paris Agreement targets. And I just want to extend a very warm thank you again to Duke for partnering with us. Today, we will be discussing how to reduce carbon emissions and taking a closer look at one particular market-based solution, carbon offsets. We will touch on how these markets have developed, who is benefiting from them, what effects they are having on reducing global CO2 emissions, and why they may not be what they seem. So now, it is a real pleasure to welcome our three distinguished speakers today. First, I would like to introduce Lawrence Baxter, who is a professor of law at Duke University and a member of the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee. Next, we have Lee Reiners, the executive director at the Global Financial Market Center and lecturing fellow at Duke Law. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Barbara Haya, a research fellow at the Center for Environment and Public Policy at UC Berkeley, where she also directs the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project. Thank you all again for making this event happen today. So now for just a bit of housekeeping, the next hour will be structured into two parts. First, we will have a dialogue with the panel, and then we will use the last 15 minutes for public Q&A. If you would like to ask us a question, please send it via the Zoom Q&A function to our team, and we will get to those. Finally, I just want to remind everyone that today's event will be recorded. So now, as companies and countries have started getting more serious about their climate targets, they have been searching for ways to reduce their emissions and make their carbon neutral or net zero pledges a reality. What you may not realize, however, is that most of these companies or countries are using a mechanism called carbon offsetting to do it. So I'll just turn to you now, Lee. Could you provide us with a very simple explanation of what offsets are?
Sure. So a carbon offset is generated when an eligible project completes a verification of an avoidance, reduction, or removal of greenhouse gas emissions. One carbon offset is supposed to equal 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent prevented from entering or being removed from the atmosphere. Carbon offsets can be used in both what are known as compliance markets as well as voluntary markets. Compliance markets briefly are market-based schemes implemented and regulated by governing bodies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the most common example of a compliance market would be a cap and trade system. And examples of cap and trade systems are the EU has an emissions trading scheme. California has a cap and trade program, and then there's several northeastern and mid-Atlantic states that are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So under a cap and trade system, some of these systems allow for the retirement of offsets as a substitute for emissions allowances. But where offsets are most commonly used is in the voluntary carbon market, which allows individuals, governments, and NGOs, as well as businesses, to purchase and retire verified voluntary carbon offsets to achieve their emissions offsetting and emissions neutrality goals. So there are multiple types of voluntary carbon offsets. There are removal offsets, and these are projects that extract emissions from the atmosphere. There's also reduction offsets, and these are projects that reduce emissions. In addition, there's natural offsets, and these are offsets that contribute to biodiversity as opposed to technological offsets that are premised on engineering and other technological developments that reduce or capture emissions.
So very complex, lots to unpack, and I'm glad that we have all three of you here to dive into this, because there is a lot. Thank you for that really nice overview, Lee. So I'm just going to turn now to Barbara. Maybe you could unpack for us just a bit more about how this started, how the mechanism got started, and how the markets have grown over the years.
Thanks. Offsets make a lot of sense conceptually, but there have been really challenges in how they've worked in practice. So carbon offsetting started under the Kyoto Protocol with a mechanism called the Clean Development Mechanism. And basically what that did is it allowed industrialized countries that had caps under the Kyoto Protocol to invest in projects that reduce emissions in developing countries which didn't have caps. And the whole idea is, well, greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere. The atmosphere doesn't care where the reductions happen. So if it's cheaper to fund projects in other countries, why shouldn't industrialized countries be allowed to do that to meet their targets? The quality challenges with that are, a report came out recently showing that 85% of those projects most likely don't reduce emissions because this mechanism was mainly supporting projects that would have happened anyway, and therefore should never have been allowed to be used by industrialized countries to meet their emission reduction targets. Next phase of offsetting shifts to the California cap and trade program and the voluntary market that responded with an alternative approach to structuring the offset program. There have been similar levels of overcrediting documented under that program. Turn to the last week when, under the Glasgow Pact, there's now a new offset program that's structured very similar to the CDM, the Kyoto Protocol's offset program. And there's a real question as to what the rules will be and will they be able to tackle this problem, this question of quality, when previous programs haven't been able to do that.
Yeah,
and
thank you so much.
Details, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's fair to say that offsetting, it's been tried, and we've had some issues with it, which I think we're going to get into just in a minute. But it's interesting that we are, this is something that's with us to stay. The genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. This mechanism is going to continue on, and it sounds like it's going to be scaled up. So now you've already alluded to some of the issues, Barbara, with them, but my next question, I want to get into some of the controversies around it. So maybe digging into that, unpacking that a little bit, why this doesn't work, or maybe it does, right? But what are some of the flaws, and what are some of the challenges with using this mechanism to reduce CO2 emissions? And this could be for anyone.
I think Barbara's probably best suited to talk about the flaws.
Yeah. So I would say that there are like two main problems, and one is the quality challenge, that the credits don't represent real emissions reductions, many of the credits. And then the other is the trade part of it, is that, if this mechanism, we're only an incentive program, we could say, well, it's having less impact than it's claiming, but it's still having an impact on emissions, which it is. But the problem is the trade, that when you trade those tons of CO2 equivalent, and someone buys them, it's causing an increase in emissions at the place where the credits are purchased, because they're purchasing those credits instead of reducing their own emissions. And given the poor quality of the market, it's keeping prices low, which means it can be really hard for companies that have carbon neutrality goals to make the difficult decision to electrify, to pay the cost of really reducing their own emissions when they can just buy cheap credits off of the market. I've thought a lot about sort of why we've seen, for 20 years of learning by doing, we're still seeing quality challenges. And I think the the issues are, so the two main reasons why we're seeing poor quality is, one is the additionality question, where, we know how to measure emissions. It's much harder to measure emissions reductions because you have to measure reductions against a counterfactual scenario that never happened. So it's inherently uncertain. Would the projects have happened anyway? Even, for those projects that wouldn't have happened anyway, what is the counterfactual scenario? What really is the impact compared to what would have happened otherwise? And I think given that uncertainty, basically what's happening with the market is that its structure, its inherent structure is a challenge for quality, in that you have a lot of uncertainty in what would have happened otherwise and how to estimate emissions reductions. And that quality is being judged by a set of decision makers that all benefit from a larger market. And the best way to get a larger market is poor quality, having each project generate more credits. So the conflict of interest is, you don't have like a physical thing where there's quality embedded in it. The buyer knows the quality. The buyer's buying a permit to emit bits in a database. And, the buyer wants cheap carbon credits to meet their targets. The seller wants to sell more credits. The third-party verifiers that are hired to audit these projects also, they want to be hired again, and they're hired by the developers themselves. And then the 4 or 5 major offset registries out there that are writing the rules for the majority of credits that are available to buy, they also benefit from a larger market. So you have this set of players that all benefit from a larger poor quality market, making quality judgments that need a lot of expertise and involve a lot of uncertainty. And I believe that that's the system that's created the poor quality today.
I think one can summarize it in lay terms like this. If you think about these markets and you think about their structuring, their functioning, and their effectiveness, they are particularly vulnerable to market failures. So for example, in structuring, we have, even within the United States, fragmented regulatory ownership. There are various regulators. Lee is the expert on how this is broken down between the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they only have fragments of it. So we don't have one overall regulator that can structure this properly. Yes, it's true that this can be done at the state level somewhat, but that only governs that state and those who do business with that state. At the functioning level, this is an economist's dream of a model that is prone to market failure. There's opacity. In other words, it's difficult to get the real information. Barbara's talked about quality declines and how easy that occurs. There's non-fungibility, in that one is in effect trading unlike for unlike. And so it's very hard to even set or engage in price discovery. Prices are set, yes, that's true, but there are externalities that are not factored into these prices. So two trading partners, the offsetter and the offsetee in an offset market, for example, have no incentive to deal with the externalities that their combined action takes. There's a potential for corruption and holding potential greenhouse gas avoidances as ransom in order to extract credits from those who are willing to pay for the credits. And so from a functional point of view, it's very hard to make these markets work. There is a valiant effort that has been led by Mark Carney, who was the head of the Financial Stability Board, and before that the governor of the Bank of England, and before that head of the central bank in Canada. in which it's called the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. It's a very valiant and laudable effort in which that group is trying to clean up the measures and so on, but they can only go but so far, and they don't claim to be able to solve the problem, that they merely will clean up that market. So from a functioning point of view, you've got a lot of difficulty. And then from an effectiveness point of view, they have not reduced, have not led to a global reduction in greenhouse gases. And if you look at the gap, and Jennifer will show us a slide that starkly depicts this, we have a long way to go, and we have to do it quickly. So it's only but so far that these markets can function. That's not to say they're bad, but it is naive, I think, to expect them to solve, even come close to solving our climate change problem.
Yeah,
It's
I
rather
think that
like, I can't help feeling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the thought just occurred to me. Laudable intentions that have evolved into something analogous to what happened in the Middle Ages with the indulgences sold by the Pope. They were designed to stop sin, but in fact became a method for paying for sin. Now, I don't mean to be critical of Catholic indulgences. They have a much more honorable intention. But sadly, once you introduce opacity and corruption or potential corruption into the picture, you start getting this kind of thing.
And just to follow up, on what Lawrence said and some of what Barbara said, if you look at the key takeaways, sort of the headlines coming out of COP26 in Glasgow the last 2 weeks, offsets underpin most of that. So, starting with, the financial commitments, you had the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero. These are banks, insurers, other asset managers, 450 in total, pledge $130 trillion to convert the global economy to clean energy. And in addition, they're committing to going net zero, and a lot of other companies have committed to going net zero. And you ask yourself, well, how are they going to achieve net zero? And you look under the hood and you see a heavy reliance on carbon offsets to meet these net zero claims. And in fact, many companies are already claiming some form of net zero. So perhaps, they're saying, well, we're net zero across our operations. And you look at what that means, and it means, well, according to their scope 1, scope 2 emissions, they are net zero, but they got there by buying offsets. And then, as Barbara alluded to, another one of the main takeaways coming out of COP26 was an agreement on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which was the last remaining article from Paris that hadn't been finalized. And that is all about creating a trading mechanism for countries to exchange these offsets. And so, taking that, all together, it's critical that we understand the scientific integrity and the robustness of these underlying offsets, because if they are not what they're claiming to be, and as Barbara has alluded to, they are in fact, in most cases, not, then we have a big problem on our hands, right? Then this entire edifice is just a charade, right? And we are not going to obtain 1.5. We're not going to obtain 2, and we're more likely heading to the hothouse Earth scenario. So it's critical that folks, we're starting it with this conversation, take a look at the underlying scientific integrity of these offsets and how they're being used, because we are staking our planetary future on these instruments.
Yeah, Lee, that was great. I think just to give, a really concrete, simple answer for people, it's what you're getting at is essentially, someone could take a flight from California to Washington, D.C. and pay for some carbon offsets. That's offered right now with a lot of airlines. And you pay a price, I don't know what it might be, say $50 or $10. You still took the plane still emitted CO2, right? And if you look at this chart that we have up here that Lawrence was mentioning earlier, if we're going to get to net zero and we're going to reach the Paris Agreement goals get to net zero by 2050 and reach the Paris Agreement goals, we have to actually reduce global emissions, and we have to do it very quickly. So I think to encapsulate this whole sort of problem with offsets, it's it can be a clever mechanism, but it's also can be abused so easily and be a real window dressing for not really, doing much of anything on actually reducing your emissions, but looking like it on paper. So I just want to segue now into sort of the question of, is there a way to regulate this? So we've learned a lot, as Barbara's done so much research on this, as well as the European Union and others, in terms of looking back at CDM and some of the earlier credit markets, and taking a lot of lessons from that. Is there a way to going forward regulate these markets and make them actually work? And what might that look like?
Yeah, so right now, these markets are lightly regulated to, unregulated. So, Barbara's mentioned the clean development mechanism, right? This is an offsetting program that is governed by the UN, and there are well-known deficiencies with that. But in addition, you have a whole host of other voluntary offset registries that establish their own standards for projects and conduct their own audits and certification. And there's really no one looking at these voluntary registries. So, where does the responsibility fall then in terms of ensuring the integrity of these underlying offsets? And it's not clear. So in the U.S. we have a separate commodities derivative regulator. We have the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and they oversee the trading of commodity derivatives. What they do not oversee is the trading of underlying commodity spot markets. So oil, cattle, other agricultural commodities. Where those markets, where those commodities are traded. The CFTC has limited authority outside of policing them for fraud and manipulation. So their jurisdiction is implicated when there's derivatives on commodities. Well, guess what? Now, in fact, we do have derivatives, futures contracts on these voluntary offsets. And I, along with John Kostiak and Steve Supan, recently submitted a comment letter to the CFTC highlighting a number of concerns that we have with the fact that these voluntary offsets, which are of dubious scientific integrity, are now underpinning derivatives contracts and are being traded by financial market participants, the largest firms on Wall Street. And one of the main concerns is that voluntary offsets kind of defy the very definition of a commodity, as Lawrence alluded to, that they are fungible. Right, so one barrel of oil is indistinguishable from another barrel of oil. One, bushel of corn is indistinguishable from another bushel of corn. But of course, the same is not true for offsets, despite the fact that one offset is supposed to equal 1 ton of CO2 equivalent reduced or abated. That is not the case, right? And there's a whole slew of scientific studies, and Barbara has documented this in depth. That is not, in fact, the case. So we have a situation where these are not fungible. These are kind of defying, again, the definition of a commodity. And now we're feeding them into derivatives contracts, and you have to ask, well, who is interested in these contracts, right? Well, frankly, at this point, it's speculators. And one of the benefits of derivatives is that it provides price transparency, and it provides a risk hedging instrument. Well, again, that's not happening here because there is very little price transparency in the voluntary offset market. When you look at, I went on the website of American Carbon Registry, Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve, Verifying Carbon Standard. You can't find the prices of the offsets on these markets. And in fact, when the CFTC, permitted the self-certification of, a voluntary offset contract based upon, aviation emissions, they acknowledged the fact that there was very little price transparency and price convergence. So the price of an offset on Verified Carbon Standard is different than the price of an offset on the Gold Standard registry. Again, defying the very logic of what it means to be a commodity. So So what we called for in our comment letter, and what John and Steve and I are going to do is build this out into a broader research paper, is call on the CFTC to conduct a thorough review of the underlying carbon markets that are feeding into these derivative products. This is something that they've done previously, actually in 2011, and they were required to do this by Dodd-Frank. So, the legislators who passed Dodd-Frank actually anticipated that the US would one day be heading towards potentially cap and trade system, or other, some other system was a price on carbon, and therefore there needs to be derivatives and hedging and whatnot. And so that legislation, Dodd-Frank, required the CFTC, along with other regulatory agencies, to produce a report on the underlying carbon markets. And it also required the CFTC to create an advisory committee called the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, or EMAC. Now, regulatory agencies have a lot of advisory committees. This is the only that I'm aware of advisory committee that was actually mandated by legislation. And so what we think the CFTC should do is kind of pump the brakes a little bit on these derivatives, right? Because what we're doing, once again, is sort of asking financialization to solve a societal problem. And we've been down this road before with the 2008 financial crisis, when everyone thought, leading up to that mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and, collateralized debt obligations were these great, risk spreading instruments that promoted home ownership and reduced lower the price of credit, so folks could get into homes. And we saw how that ended up. And so when you have derivatives that have no economic purpose, which I would argue is what we have right now with these offset derivatives, we're heading for a world of pain, which is going to be particularly pronounced given the fact that that world is going to be a lot hotter. So that's going to pose additional financial stability risks. So this is something that I think all financial regulators should take seriously. But the problem, again, is that these underlying spot markets are not regulated. No one has the authority here. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as Lauren said, they oversee disclosure of securities issuers. And one of the things that I've argued for, and many others as well, as the SEC looks towards requiring public companies to disclose their climate-related risk, these companies should also have to disclose their use of offsets and the type of offsets they're relying on, because that does impact the risks that they're exposed to, and it would allow investors to measure their credibility to the net zero commitments that they're making. Because without that, these are just words, and there needs to be some type of accountability mechanism here that requires climate risk disclosure, and that disclosure should also include offsets.
Can I ask you a question, Lee? So so there are different types of offsets or ways that they're treated, right? There's a compliance offset where there is a regulatory entity, and that is the entity that's running the compliance, the cap and trade program or whatever. And then under the voluntary market, you have some, right now, small portion that's traded as derivatives, and the rest is just bought and sold on the market. For the part that's traded as derivatives, I'm curious if this CFTC does the study that you're saying they should do. What could come of it? Like, what power does the CFTC, like, what could come of this study?
Well, I think, a couple of things. One is that just inform, the market. A lot of us are just kind of flying blind right now. I mean, the CFTC has a mission for, price transparency, price formation. I mean, that's what derivatives are designed to do. Yet there's no evidence that derivatives on voluntary offsets are accomplishing that price transparency and price formation. Because if we are going to require companies to either engage in cap and trade or rely on offsets, that's a cost that they're going to want to hedge. And there's nothing inherently wrong with derivatives. But we have a situation now where derivatives aren't facilitating their intended purpose. I think also this study could drive some greater consistency across the voluntary standard setters, because these derivative contracts are allowing offsets from different registries to fulfill the obligations under the contract. When the contract expires, right, you have to physically deliver in offset. And right now, sellers can kind of pick and choose. And they have actually an advantage, of course, pick to deliver the offset that's the lowest price right now. So I think they can drive some convergence in the standards. But I hear your point, Barbara, that at the end of the day, they have limited authority in these spot markets. And that's why I think Congress might want to consider passing legislation that would give the EPA a greater say here, because financial regulators, they're not experts in climate measurement and greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to be careful that we're not putting too much on their plate. But the CFTC has recently created a climate risk unit, so that as of March 2021, there is a new unit at the CFTC dedicated specifically to focusing on the role of derivatives in addressing climate-related risks. So it seems like this is exactly the type of topic that they might want to take on. But I agree that it would be incomplete, but it'd help, I guess, with price transparency and price formation.
Let me supplement and to say, I think Lee is exactly right. The CFTC does not have plenary jurisdiction. In fact, it is limited as Lee's described. But the good news about it is, first of all, that agency among all the financial agencies was the first one out of the starting gates to get the dangers of climate change. And the commissioner who created the subcommittee that did that and produced a superb report is now chairman of the SEC, Ross Benham. So it's an agency that does get it. Yes, its jurisdiction is limited, but in that respect, while the ideal would be Congress, in the absence of action by Congress, leadership does tend to expand to fill a vacuum. Yep. And I think the CFTC has been leading the financial agencies. All of them have started to change and create their climate czars, as it were. But I wouldn't regard it as a lost cause. I think in setting a clarity and standards that we could all use, the CFTC will help. But in an ideal world, yeah, Congress would either give the EPA or another regulator plenary jurisdiction.
And one final point on this, and it relates to a question that we received from my writing partner, John Kostiak. The CFTC does, as I said, they do have enforcement power for fraud and manipulation in underlying commodity spot markets. I would imagine that if they were to kick the tires on some of these voluntary offset projects and registries, they would find a whole host of fraud and manipulation and misrepresentations. Perhaps some of these registries are knowingly claiming these offsets are or these projects are facilitating X amount of emissions reduction, when they know that, in fact, that is not the case, because they have a financial incentive to do so. So I think that the CFTC should actually put this on their enforcement agenda, because they do have fraud and manipulation enforcement powers. And again, I guess I'll leave it there for now. But there's a lot I think that they can do and they should do, because this is a financial stability issue. And one final piece too is a lot of these financial institutions are trading in these offsets too. So not only are they using offsets to meet their net zero commitments, right, but they're engaging in the trading just like they would trade stocks and bonds, and now derivatives. So they're using offsets to meet net zero, and they're also profiting off of the trading and sourcing of offsets for their clients. So they're kind of double dipping here, and I think that's another area that financial regulators broadly might want to take a look at.
Well, one area where Europe might be leading the way, Jennifer drew my attention to the German competition agency with the Wettbewerbszentrale and its actions against claims to neutrality, carbon neutrality. And I was amused to see some of the examples that they've ruled are false claims, such as neutral frozen potatoes, climate neutral candles, and climate neutral plastic bin bags. And there are more apparently coming down the pike. But that is an example of what a regulator with teeth could do if it had direct jurisdiction over the actual spot market, to use an oversimplifying phrase.
And I Thanks for bringing that up, Lawrence. I think that's so interesting. Especially how it seems like those in Europe seem to be a little bit ahead of the curve sometimes with this stuff than we are in the U.S. But I wanted to turn back to you, Barbara, and just, I know that you've done so much research in this area. Maybe you could give us a couple of examples of some concrete, fraud that's been in the system, or just some issues with counting that Lee was also alluding to.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think that it's hard to distinguish fraud from, I think the core problem is really in the rules established by the registries that today on the voluntary market are writing the rules for how to estimate emissions reductions, and that the participants are following the rules that are set by these 4 or 5 major registries. But examples are, for one, in the US, around half of all credits are from so-called improved forest management projects. That's a protocol that pays forest landowners in the country to manage their lands in a way that holds more carbon and more carbon than the baseline. And just 2 quick examples of over-crediting from this important protocol. One is that it sets the baseline for most projects at the average carbon per acre for forest land. So by definition, half of our forest carbon is on land that holds more than average carbon. And what this means is that landowners that were already managing their land in a way that held more carbon than the average, even if they have for many decades, now they can get credited as if they would have cut their forests to that average, even if they wouldn't have. And certainly some of these projects are really good projects, and the landowner would have cut or logged the forest to that average level, but many are projects that at least in the near term or in the next decades wouldn't have been logged like that, but they're still able to generate credits. And that's sort of a known problem with this major project type. I guess just another example, I guess from my PhD research in India on the Clean Development Mechanism projects is, their large hydropower, wind power, biomass power, these power sector projects were the majority. And it was very clear in talking to project developers that, I kept hearing that the offset income was just cream on the top. It was just a little bit extra that they're being paid to do projects that they were doing for, because they were cost effective on their own. And then I guess as we're thinking about how to move forward, the question is, given how complex forests are in the US and biomass power plants are in India, and all these other project types, happening around the world in all different sectors and all different contexts, is how do you get a system that addresses all of the complexity of, across these sectors and regions? What is quality in that context? And, able to do that type of analysis, which involves, understanding decision-making on the ground, understands the science of how do you estimate carbon held underground, underground in forests, in soils, et cetera, like all of the uncertainty in carbon accounting. How do you get a system that addresses all of this uncertainty?
And that's a key point, because it needs to be a system level solution. You look at the incentives that are in place, everyone has an incentive to create these offsets, right? The registries clearly have an incentive to create more offsets, right? And to grant credits to projects that may not be deserving. companies have an incentive to buy the offset so that they can claim, net zero. Obviously, developers, as Barbara touched on, have an incentive to receive the income from the offsets, even if they were going to build the project anyway. And so, everyone has an incentive to push in one direction, and unfortunately, it's the wrong direction. And I think that is why there needs to, there's a role for government here to correct that. I mean, this is a kind of a miniature market failure within a broader market failure when it comes to climate, right, Lawrence?
Absolutely. It can't fix it by itself. I think the motives are laudable. But just as I used the analogy of buying indulgences from a corrupt medieval pope, I'm also reminded, as Barbara was talking about, protection rackets. With the mob, somebody will show up at your store and say you need protection. Well, now we got forests with people showing up and saying we'll protect you if we get paid. It's just vulnerable to a lot of degradation of quality and misdirection.
And Jennifer, before maybe we get into the Q&A, I want to ask Barbara another question, which is, the big news coming out of COP is around Article 6. So Barbara, can you just maybe, provide a little more clarity around, Article 6, how it pertains to the clean development mechanism and some of the concerns that you have, having now digested kind of the Article 6 announcements?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, under the Glasgow Pact, a core negotiating issue was carbon markets, and would carbon markets be accepted? And yes, they agreed to allow two different types of carbon markets. One is between countries, and the other is an offsetting program. The new offsetting program looks very much like the old offsetting program, the clean development mechanism that we've been talking about. And so much so that they've also, and this I'm surprised and horrified by, that they allowed these old CDM credits, or the more recent ones, the ones from projects that have registered since 2013, that these credits can now flow into and be used by parties to meet their Paris agreements. And, they still need to write the rules of this new offset program. So there's potential for it to be better than the CDM and better than the current voluntary market. But I have to ask, if we've seen, poor outcomes in 20 years of offsetting, why do we expect this to be different? And how can we make it different? And there's a challenge at the international climate change agreement level, in that you have a tremendous amount of politics at play, and countries want their offset projects to qualify, and every country wants its own offset projects to qualify. So there's another race to the bottom, right?
And Barbara, my understanding is that Article 6 tried to address this issue of double counting through what's known as a corresponding adjustment. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Yeah. It basically means, so let's say you have two countries, and they both have a target. And let's say there's an offset project in this country that they sell credits to this country. So this country buys the credits, and then they're allowed to emit more because they bought the credits. What the corresponding adjustment says is you need to, if you're going to use the credits here, you need to deduct them here. Mm-hmm. There's still a quality issue, because then this country might be buying credits that don't represent real emissions reductions, and it reduces what they're doing. But yeah, it requires that that if this country is going to use those claimed reductions, that this country doesn't also. And
you're skeptical. I mean, I know the rules are still being sketched out, but you're skeptical that the UN can sort of drive greater consistency and scientific integrity here.
So you were talking about, Lawrence, about the Carney task force. And from what I understand is if they're going to be successful, they have, you're saying that they're trying to filter out the poor quality credits. If they're going to be successful, they have to shrink the market to just a small fraction of the current credits. And I haven't seen evidence that they're willing to shrink it enough in order to only certify credits that with confidence represent the amount of emissions abatement that they claim. And at the UN level, the question is, are they willing to really rein in the program enough to ensure the quality of the credits? And it's a big difference from where we are today.
And I'm not sure I understand all the dimensions of that task force at this stage. They do have a lot of good material at their website, but I think their intention is the contrary, right? They want to scale the markets rather than shrink them, which makes it harder and harder as you scale them, right?
Well, you can't scale a market that doesn't work. You just get more poor quality. You need to first shrink, and you need to first get the rules and get the rules in place so that the buyers can trust those credits, and then scale from that small quality place.
You mean you can't make up losses by increasing volume?
Yeah.
So we have some questions coming in, and I think this might be a great point to sort of shift towards some alternatives. So we've been talking about, essentially all the challenges associated with offsets. And I think, Barbara, you gave us a great insight into, what just happened at COP and how, we will be living with offsets in some form for the foreseeable future as, as a possibility for, companies and countries to claim that they're making progress towards their Paris Agreement goals. But, apart from regulating them more and trying to get the quality up and some of the various things we've been chatting about, what would be some other alternatives that have nothing to do with offsets? What should we be pushing people towards, companies and, countries, in terms of actually making meaningful CO2 emissions?
I would start with suggestions that have been made already about contribution markets, that we should create incentive systems that incent companies and other emitters to create a net reduction in their greenhouse gases emissions. And I don't know exactly how all that would work, but tax credits come to mind. Technology forcing regulation and legislation. It's a very sensitive subject because it was difficult to do with the auto industry and reducing air polluting emissions, but it was done. It's not far enough, but it certainly made a huge difference. California had to engage in that. That's why California is still the leader as far as emissions are concerned for pollution, because things got so bad there that they literally had no choice. So I think a mixture of trying to make the offset markets work and the cap and trade market work, whether it be through a carbon tax and setting the price right on that, or through a cap, or through offsets. That's one thing. I don't think we should write that off, but I do think we have to supplement it. Secondly, with accountable regulators who are equipped and can be held accountable. That right now, it's the fragmentation is such that no one regulator can. We talked about that. Thirdly, incentives that may be through a tax mechanism. And fourth, maybe target-based legislation or regulations that, given the urgency, and back to Jennifer's slide, we will be in a desperate situation in only a few short years. So we have to move faster than we are in order to get the reduction in global greenhouse emissions, which offsets simply don't do. So and this is all very speculative, Jennifer, but I think we have to look at all these options. And, that would bring in a lot of different multidisciplinary experts. I know that taxes have been considered many times. And then there's, the experiment of some of the big states. California is one of them. Fortunately, there are progressive states that are addressing the problem. more forcefully than we are at the federal level that we may be able to learn from. And then Europe, we mentioned Europe earlier, which may be making better progress. We have to learn more about that. I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and it's going to be difficult all around. There are no silver bullets.
Yeah, I would like to propose 3 different things. I mean, one is, what should we be doing? We need to be reducing our own emissions first and foremost, not offsetting first. And, there are a whole slew of different, regulatory measures and incentives, et cetera. I'm really focusing on those. From the perspective of the voluntary market, if a company or an individual wants to do more, right now, offsets is an option. I think it's what I would love to see the offset market develop into, or an alternative to it, is other ways that individuals and companies can put money into climate mitigation that is not the current offset market, like different funds, or major companies can help get new projects off the ground. There are many ways to invest in climate mitigation. It doesn't have to be buying offsets. And then lastly, I think in any case, disclosure rules are essential. That right now, a company that reduces its own emissions to zero, doing the hard work of electrifying its vehicle fleet, getting off of natural gas, 100% renewable energy, and call itself carbon neutral, as can that company that goes to their broker and buys inexpensive credits off of the market. And I think it's really essential to disclose, that what the emissions are and what else that company is doing in addition, rather than just having that one number, and disclosing what, if they're doing other things to cover their residual emissions, what are those things?
Yeah, I mean, to second that, disclosure is so critical here. And, and Matt asked a question in the Q&A about, what should institutions who have already committed to buying offsets en route to their carbon neutrality goals do? I don't think any one of us is advocating to make, offsets illegal. I mean, we're talking about voluntary markets. If a company wants to voluntarily, buy an offset, fine. The problem is when we as a global community are relying on voluntary offsets in this voluntary offset market to meet, our Paris commitments to, 1.5 to 2 degrees, then that's where the real problem kicks in. So, I believe in disclosure. I think, if companies are relying on offsets to meet their net zero commitments, they should be required to disclose that. They should disclose the specific project, right? The registry that they purchased it from. And they should be required to disclose other data elements that would allow investors to assess if these firms are actually meeting their net zero commitments. Because absent that information and data, it's just words on a page. It's meaningless if it can't be measured again. So I would hope that the SEC, in their forthcoming climate risk disclosure rule, look critically at these net zero commitments. What information do investors need to assess the credibility of these commitments? But let's also not fool ourselves in thinking that just disclosure alone is somehow going to reduce to lower emissions. There's no data that would indicate that. So going back to the CFTC climate report that they released back in the fall of 2020, the number one recommendation was put a price on carbon. And I think ultimately that's what needs to happen. We're just sort of grasping at half measures until then. Now there are very real concerns around how that would be impacted by felt by lower income folks. But you look at a cap and trade system, the reason it works is because you're actually capping emissions at the source. And there's a well-established mechanism, governed by the EPA, to measure those emissions at the source, and then you let the market allocate those units, those emission units, accordingly, and you arrive at a true, social cost on carbon. So I'm a big, proponent of cap and trade. President Obama, tried to get it through. It didn't pass. But some states are doing their own thing, including, on the East Coast, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in our state, North Carolina, is considering joining RGGI, and I hope they do. But I think there should be a nationwide cap and trade program.
Yeah, these are great ideas. We have a slide just in the last couple minutes here about, just to illustrate a little bit more some of the different, what some of the different big companies have done with offsets. Just to give an example, just to show you all what, how this has looked in reality. And I think it's just nice to sort of illustrate what we're talking about. So, for example, Google, they've eliminated their entire carbon legacy through a purchase of high quality offsets. But, I don't know if you could find out what those are. We possibly could if we dug deep enough. And then, you have Total, right? A French fossil fuels company selling their first carbon neutral liquefied natural gas shipment just last year using offsets projects. I feel like that these are kind of dubious claims, right? At best. So just wanted to hit on some of these really great questions we're getting. And it goes into the idea of, alternatives that we've been talking about, and actually the integrity of regulated markets. So maybe this could go to Lee, I guess, this first one here. For the RGGI and California that have regulated carbon trading, what do you think about the integrity of those markets? Actually, this could be for Barbara.
Yeah,
too.
well, Barbara can speak probably to the California market. So, for those who aren't familiar, in a cap and trade system, you have some government entity, cap the overall level of emissions. Generally, it's, for RGGI, it's, power generator. So utility companies are subject to the cap. And then you can, there's different ways you can allocate then, emission units under that cap. RGGI is an auction-based system. So participants have to bid on emission units would entitle them to emit carbon dioxide. And in some of these programs, they allow the participants to use offsets as part of the, to meet their allocation. RGGI, my understanding, actually does not, and I recently spoke to Benjamin Grumbles, who's the environmental head in the state of Maryland, who oversees RGGI. I think it's something they're considering, allowing offsets to be used in their cap and trade system. California does allow participants to use offsets. And I think, Barbara can touch on the known issues with the California offsets. The EU emissions trading scheme did for a while allow offsets, but I think in 2013, they actually banned the use of offsets as part of that. So, I would hope that offsets, if there was a nationwide cap and trade system, that offsets aren't a part of that. And I'll let Barbara kind of talk maybe a little bit about the issues with the California system.
Yeah, I know that we're close to time, so I'll just say one thing, and that is, California's cap and trade program has a large offset program, and 82% of credits are from the improved forest management projects that I discussed as being largely overcredited. So there's a quality challenge here in California too.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to let Barbara have the last word there. We are just coming up to time. Thank you, everyone, for joining and submitting wonderful questions. I think we got to most of them. There might be a few that we didn't answer fully. Missy, if you want to pull up the slide at the end, if you want to continue the conversation, you can contact myself or Lee. Go to our websites. And, I think an hour is obviously not quite enough time to unpack all of these issues. This is super complex. But thank you once again. Thank you to the center. for this really great event. And I hope to see you all around.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Barbara and Lawrence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.